So the highlight of APEC, the economic leaders meeting, is now underway, and a series of high-level diplomatic events have been taking place here in Gyeongju on the sidelines of the multilateral gathering. For more on this, we're joined today by Professor Mun Ki-hong, Assistant Professor at the Division of International and Area Studies at Pukyong National University. Thanks for coming in today.
Thank you for having me.
Also joining us here in the studio is Dr. Mi-kyoung from Gyeongsang National University. Welcome to the studio.
Great to be here in Gyeongju with Arirang.
Right. And so Professor Mun, I want to start with you. So the convention center right behind us is where the world leaders are currently gathered for the economic leaders meeting. How do you think the meeting will play out? And can we expect to see any notable outcomes throughout the two-day meeting?
Well, this year's APEC in Gyeongju carries a great deal of symbolic and strategic weight. It has been 2 decades since Korea last hosted, and this year's meeting takes place amid significant global uncertainty, such as the erosion of rule-based trade system, deepening protectionism, and realignment in global supply chains. So since the Bogor Declaration in 1994, the APEC's vision has been an open and free trading system in the Asia Pacific. But recent years, we have seen advanced economies step back from their leadership role, and government turned inward in response to domestic pressure. So in this vacuum, as we saw the private sector technology firms, AI innovators, and green industry leaders is beginning to set the pace. So the CEO summit here in Gyeongju reflected that transition vividly. So APEC's 21 member economies together account for about half of global trade and 60% of world GDP. So that alone shows how central this forum is to regional and global stability. So if the meeting produces even a modest Gyeongju declaration that reaffirms rule-based trade, recenters the cooperation on sustainability, human well-being, that would already be a meaningful diplomatic success.
Right, absolutely. We'll have to see how that goes throughout the two-day meeting. And Dr. Kim, President Lee Jae Myung held a series of bilateral summits on the sidelines of APEC here in Gyeongju, one of that being a summit with the new Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi. Their summit last evening was their first face-to-face meeting, right?
Yes, you are right. They actually almost met in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia for ASEAN summit meetings. But Madam Prime Minister had to leave early because she had to prepare for the upcoming trip by American President Donald Trump. And yesterday, the two leaders finally met, and I watched the live broadcasting of their summit meeting, and the atmosphere was very friendly and cordial. So I think it went very well. And some of the things they did not talk about were like economy, security, history issues, and it has a lot to do with logistics of the meeting, because the allotted time for their meeting was just half an hour. So when we factor in the time for Korean-Japanese consecutive translation, the two leaders really didn't have sufficient amount of time to talk about other issues.
Right. So we'll have to see if they do meet again in the near future.
Yes.
Right. And Professor Mun, Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, is now in Gyeongju for the meeting. And this morning we saw Xi taking part in the economic leaders meeting along with other world leaders. What might be on the agenda when Xi meets President Lee Jae Myung on Saturday before going back to China?
I think that will be historical meeting as well, since Xi Jinping visited South Korea for the first time in last 11 years. So that alone makes the summit a symbolic reset in the relationship that has been going in between both countries, South Korea and China, China and South Korea. So economically, as President Lee mentioned a couple of days ago, the the Lee administration would like to update the FTA, Korea-China FTA, and want to more cooperation in the sector in AI, semiconductors, and green energy. Well, strategically, this summit will be about balancing and reassurance. So President Lee will seek reaffirm that Korea's engagement with China is complementary, not contradictory, with and its alliance with the United States. And there was a surprising moment that the U.S. Government approved the building nuclear-powered submarine. So that will be some kind of tricky issues, but it's not likely to discuss on the table in honest way.
Right, we'll get to that in a moment. And before that, while Chinese President Xi Jinping was here, he also met with U.S. President Donald Trump, and they agreed to sort of ease tensions, with U.S. Promising to lower tariffs on China, and China promising to sort of ease and pause export controls on rare earth minerals. So what's your take on that? Do you think the trade tensions have now been completely resolved?
Well, it might be hard to say that the tension was completely resolved. Well, I guess the atmosphere and then the results were sort of positive, but the substance remained tentative, I guess. So if we look closely at that summit, this is a limited truce, kind of ceasefire, I think, not a structural resolution, because their agreement was not the final decision. And then, according to White House statements or former signed agreements, there were just few countries join this tariff agreement. So this is kind of rhetoric, de-escalation in this sense. But the structural competition might be continues under the surface.
Right. So a lot of things still left to discuss. And Dr. Kim, going back to the summit between Lee and Takaichi, there were concerns that the new Japanese leader would take a hardline stance against historical issues. Although that wasn't mentioned last night's meeting, how do you think the bilateral relations will play out in terms of historical issues?
You know, two things that I like to draw our attention to that were mentioned during the short meeting. One was that President Lee's emphasis on the commonalities, not the differences between the two nations. He talked about geographical proximity between Korea and Japan, and he also mentioned too close for comfort kind of phrase when the neighbors are too close to each other, and the occasional conflict and tension between the two countries. He said it's something normal, something natural. And another thing that he mentioned was that, you know, by explaining the symbolic significance of this meeting venue, Gyeongju, he also tried to bring in Madam Prime Minister's hometown, Nara, in order to explain 1,000 years of bilateral history. Yeah. So that was something really positive. And another thing that I like to pay attention to is Ms. Takaichi's mention of not only bilateral cooperation between Korea and Japan, but also trilateral cooperation involving the US. Right. So her primary concern was how to strengthen the security cooperation in the region involving the US. And both of them commonly mentioned the importance of future-oriented relationship between the two countries. So in answering your question, I think both countries have agreed upon building future-oriented future by making efforts such as, he said something really interesting. Another thing was, we need to discern problem from tasks. When we have problems between the two countries, we can get together and try to solve it. But when there are tasks to be taken care of, both countries need to cooperate to get the job done. So I think both leaders are on the same page regarding what kind of future they are aspiring for.
I see, that's good to hear. We'll have to see how that relations play out. And Professor Mun, President Lee Jae Myung also held a separate meeting with Donald Trump, and many thought a trade deal would be unlikely, but they did manage to reach a deal. What's your take on this?
I guess the outcome of the summit between South Korea and the US and South Korea is largely positive, both in tone, in substance. So it demonstrated that despite its initial skepticism, Seoul and Washington were able to produce tangible progress and, more importantly, restore momentum to the economic alliance. So I checked both statements from Blue House and White House, and from Washington's perspective, I guess this summit was about success story in economic diplomacy, as we see from Donald Trump's atmosphere. And from Seoul's side, the emphasis was on more about stability and sustainability. So what is remarkable is that two different narratives actually complement each other. For the US focused on the scale and strategic ambition, South Korea focused on structure and the safety. So together, I guess they represented a maturing alliance that combines opportunity and responsibility. Of course, as we often say, the devil is in detail. So translating this broad agreement into operational level will require coordination in a serious way on technology transfer, like industrial participation and fiscal transparency as well.
Right, it came to us as a surprise, especially because they have been in negotiations for months now, and it was good to hear that they were able to reach a trade agreement. And Dr. Kim, just before coming to South Korea, U.S. President Donald Trump stopped by in Japan, and while meeting Japan's new leader, they promised a golden age in bilateral relations. What stood out to you the most during their meeting?
You know, when I heard the term a golden age, I honestly thought that was hyperbolic euphemism. You know, Madam Prime Minister Takaichi became Japan's leader 10 days ago, and she didn't have sufficient amount of time to say her side of story in what kind of relationship she desires to build with any country in the world. So, you know, I kind of thought that was rhetorical on both ends. But also, you know, we can think of a historical example where the US and Japan did enjoy a golden age. For instance, in early 1980s, Nakasone, Yasuhiro, and American President Ronald Reagan did have a really intimate and trusting relationship where either of them just could pick up the phone and call each other party, and they were on first name basis. That kind of intimacy and trust building, it takes time. So I don't think it's possible at this stage to describe US-Japan relationship as a golden age. I think that is some sort of like wishful thinking on both sides. But you know, time will tell. So we'll keep on watching, you know, how it's going to evolve.
Right, I guess it's too early to tell at this stage. All right, I'm afraid that's all the time we have for today. Thank you, Dr. Kim, for joining us today. And Professor Mun, thank you so much for coming in today.
Thank you for having me again.
On that note, now that ends our team coverage of APEC-related stories here in Gyeongju for this newscast. Back to you, Doyan.